Welcome to DejaVue.
Your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet. And here with me on the microphone is Michael.
I am a full-time Vue educator and produce lots of content, newsletters, things like that, including this podcast, which I record with Alex.
Exactly. And I'm part of the Next Core team. I'm also creating quite some content on YouTube, stream every now and then Twitch. And I am a web engineering consultant by day. And today we talk about a topic that might be interesting for most of you, which is server-side rendering. What is it? Do you need it? Why would you use it? And what are all these other weird acronyms in that space?
Yeah, so let's start with what is server-side rendering to begin with, just so that we can start off on the same page. And some of you may not know what it is or the exact specifics. So what would your definition of server-side rendering be?
Well, I mean, we could go all the way back and say, oh yeah, my old PHP application is server-side rendered because, oh, there's a PHP server and it renders the HTML. But if we are in the JavaScript ecosystem, and if we talk about single-page applications, then server-side rendering means rendering your single-page application on the server, mostly a node server, on the initial request. That's very important. So only if you like hard reload the page or if you click from an external source, like from Google, then your site will be server rendered. And ideally afterwards, it will just behave as a plain old single page application as before.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about historically that websites have almost always been server-side rendered. Like if you go back to the 90s, we had JavaScript back then, but we weren't really building single-page apps that just lived in the browser. We were always hitting the server with every single request, button click, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, then Ajax came and said like, hey, JavaScript can do a bit more here and there, but we're still, in a way, we're still torn with like, oh yeah, the server still renders things and we can load more. And there was XML and then finally some good thing like JSON so we can send data. And yeah, eventually SPAs were born by saying, why can't we do all of the things in the browser, in the front end, and like use the backend more as an API?
Yeah, and this pendulum almost swings back and forth, it seems, between single page apps are the hottest thing, and then no, they're terrible for performance. They've got all these issues. Let's render everything on the server. And then, after a couple of years, people are like, wait, we can do so much more with single page apps. So let's, the pendulum swings back the other direction, and it almost seems like a bit of whiplash we've gotten in the web development community here.
Yeah, it's true. But I think we can't do without both. Like ideally, in the future, we have something where the server and the client, they work together hand in hand. We embrace the web standards. And I like to see some moves, for example, what Remix is doing with like, okay, we basically have a single page application, but we progressively enhance it. Even without JavaScript, you can still send forms. So that's super interesting to see. And also what React is doing with server components and what Nuxt server components are doing to say, like, we reduce the amount of JavaScript we need to render some stuff. And from there, we can improve performance-wise, but also still keep the same mental model of the same framework, and of the same code we write.
And I like what Nuxt does with the hybrid approach, where we try and take the best of both worlds of server-side rendering and single page apps and basically stay right in the middle. You could argue if it's leaning one direction or the other, but where we use server-side rendering on that first request, and then after that we can bootstrap into a single page app and get the benefits there. So I think that's a pretty neat way to sort of blend the two. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I also think it's really helpful, but of course introduces some more problems, let's say. you have more complexity because you always have to think, oh, what if this is rendered on a server? And for me, like I remember back in 2017, maybe 2018, something like that, must be 17, when I first got in touch with Nux, was like, okay, server-side rendering, super helpful, because back then I had a project, was public facing, and as we all know, single page applications, well, they don't render HTML straight away. The JavaScript generates it, and that's not so nice for search engines. So I thought, okay, server-side rendering will solve all my problems, and it did, but it introduced some more. Like, okay, when does that server rendering actually happen? Is it every request? And as just mentioned, it's just the initial one, but it's something it's another concept to understand.
So when would you recommend that someone uses server-side rendering in their application? So maybe, I guess the more standard approach of building Vue applications has been, before Nuxt became as popular as it is now, the standard was to build these Vue single-page applications. And the one place that I worked at, we actually used Ruby on Rails, which is a server-side rendered framework, but it actually bootstrapped itself into this single-page app where, that initial page render was done with Ruby on Rails, but then now we've got a Vue single-page app that's running. What would you say are the reasons you would want to switch to server-side rendering, or how would you think about that? Because you did mention there are some tricks or catches there with server-side rendering.
Yes, absolutely. So if you use Vue more or less as progressive enhancement of like, okay, I want to do some interactivity, but I don't render my full front end in it, then switching to server-side rendering is almost impossible. I know there were some projects saying, oh yeah, maybe we can do the V8 engine in PHP and whatnot, but it never really took off. And in that case, yeah, render your page in Rails or in Laravel or Django, whatever, and then use Vue on top of it. It's totally fine. But as soon as you have the whole front end under the control of Vue, then it really makes sense thinking about server-side rendering when you need search engine optimization. So if it's like a public page you want to share, and when it's performance critical. So typically any kind of landing page, any kind of e-commerce, that's always a very tricky area because lots of things to show, has to be very like recent, updated data. And that's like the classic example where server-side rendering helps. But even for your blog or portfolio page, they just want to like put out there, then server-side rendering makes sense. But now that I think about it, we can even go the other way around. We're saying if your application is behind authentication, then we don't really need server-side rendering at all because no search engine will ever hit that. And well, people have to log in anyway and to wait a little bit. So that's not a big of a deal. So as long as it's not public facing, no server-side rendering is needed. And it's also important to mention that you don't have to turn on the switch or turn it off for server-side rendering for your application. You can also say, oh, hey, I have routes, let's say /admin, and everything starting with /admin should not be server rendered because it's, well, the admin area. But hey, my blog page should be server rendered. So you can also make sure that you have a nice fine-grained structure saying, okay, that part should be server rendered and that part shouldn't.
But even if you had, for example, this admin section that's behind authentication, wouldn't you still get some performance benefits from having it server-side rendered? I guess it would depend on what exactly that page is rendering.
Yeah, so you would definitely have a better perceived performance because what happens in detail during server-side rendering is, okay, you send a request and the server returns the HTML. So you see straight away, okay, this is what the page will show. It also ideally includes some inline CSS, so I actually have the styles too. And then the JavaScript is also sent, but that will be downloaded, executed, parsed, and then Vue and Nuxt will boot up and basically go through the send HTML and more or less convert it over to like Vue's representation, to Vue's own VDOM representation. And then for interactivity, attach some listeners. And that whole process from, okay, I see the HTML, but right now it's not interactive because there are no listeners and Vue is not up yet, until the point where it's up, that's called hydration. very important process, and it's a little bit intensive, especially CPU intensive, if you have a big page or like very complex components. And while the perceived performance could be better for people saying, oh yeah, I see the page, you might have the problem that they want to click something, but they can't because the listener isn't there yet. And there are also ways to improve that, but I think that's something to keep in mind. Yeah, you could improve performance with SSR, but then you have to make sure that the hydration cost is low, that you can ideally delay that or say, hey, these parts shouldn't be hydrated, and so on and so on.
Right. And which is why Nuxt has that hybrid mode where it switches between the two.
Yeah, exactly. And you can even go further. There are ways to delay the hydration to say, okay, as soon as I interact or scroll, then I want to actually do hydration. So you have a better first, the first page load is faster. You get a faster, largest contentful paint. It's one of the metrics that's relevant there.
Right.
But then you have to be very careful because there's another metric called interaction to next paint, which is a core web vital, same to LCP. And that basically says, oh, if you click something, how long does it take until the UI shows something? And if you say, hey, on click, I want to do the whole CPU intensive hydration part, it might reduce the value there, causing troubles. Also because your users, okay, click, and I wait. Maybe on your, I don't know, MacBook M2, like with all the fancy devs having that, it's like no problem. But if you're on a mobile device, or maybe it's also an older device with German cell phone reception and mobile data, which means it's not that nice, then it might take longer. And people are like, oh, I clicked. Why does nothing happen? I click again. And maybe people are frustrated and don't know what's going on.
That's an interesting point to bring up with single page apps versus server side rendering, where you have control over the server and how fast it is. You don't have control over the network speed, and you also certainly don't have control over your users' devices, whether they're on my phone, which I still have an old iPhone 6S, which is 8 years old now, and certain websites are very, very slow because probably the dev was like, whatever, it's fast on my machine. And so the single page app, on that case, you're offloading more of the processing and those things to the end user's device versus on the server. So yeah, that's an interesting trade-off to consider.
Absolutely. And the problem is, if you have that hydration part in Vue, especially, what Vue is doing is doing the same thing on the server, but again, because you want to get to the point where the client is in the same state as the server. So the client will get some values from the server, but also has to build up all the components again. And other frameworks, like for example, there's Quick that's experiments with resumability, and there are also lots of other ways of dealing with hydration, or saying, hey, I use island architecture, which for example Iris or Astro is doing, saying, okay, there are parts that are not really necessary to hydrate, and other things that should be interactive. I want to hydrate them and not all static content. That's something I'm very interested in, especially in the Vue space, to see where this is going.
Yeah, some of these frameworks have some really interesting approaches with how they incrementally, progressively do that without having to load a whole bunch of stuff. It's just like on demand, which is it kind of breaks my brain to think about because it's a totally new way of thinking about these things.
And it once again brings other complexity. Like, oh yeah, if you don't have to do the whole, if you don't have to replay or do the same things on the client as on the server, and let's say you send a console log on the server and think, why doesn't that appear on the client? You also have to teach developers these concepts. So the problem is not only okay, hydration is kind of solved, let's say, but how you actually teach people how that works or make a nice abstraction around that is yet another issue to be solved.
Yeah, and it's one of the trickiest parts of using Nuxt that I've found is that server-side rendering introduces these different complexities because you're running it once on the server, but you're not running it exactly the same as it would run on the client. And so if you're used to just like client side single page apps, then you have to shift your thinking quite a bit to be like, okay, it's going to generate this payload and I want things to sync up properly. This part, certain lifecycle hooks are not run on the server even.
Yeah.
And why am I getting this weird bug? Because, it did something on the server, but it's not doing it on the client. And then, there's, I find most of the bugs and weird things that I come across for when I'm writing my own code has to do with that. Maybe because I'm like already comfortable with the Vue specific side of things, and I'm still, my brain is still taking a bit to get around to the next way of doing things.
I think it's very common. And just a quick mention here, you can even run your own server-side rendering setup with something like Vike, which was previously Vite plugin SSR, or even roll it fully on your own. Or you can even use Quasar, which also supports it. But in the most common scenarios, if you use SSR and Vue, then you rather don't want to roll your own because it's painful and you have to deal with all the issues that, Nuxt is already solving for you, let's say. So that's one thing. And the other issue, of course, the complexity, especially with, which data has to go from the server to the client? How can I mark the data so it goes over there?
Mm-hmm.
Or like, what are these weird hydration errors, which are always coming up?
Yeah.
And I know it can be tricky because you go for, I'm doing everything in the client. It's fine. A little bit of window here, a little bit of document.query selector here. Please don't. But I use this chart library here, no problem. On the server, it isn't that easy because there's none of that there. No window, no document.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something definitely worth dealing with and understanding. Like, not into every tiny detail, it's fine. But having that idea, how the process of server-side rendering, what we just talked about, works, that is only for initial request. And that's, the complexity shouldn't be underestimated.
So another similar term is SSG. So we've got SSR, we've got SPA, and we also have SSG. And I have been confused about these terms, especially because they're kind of used interchangeably almost, it seems.
Yeah.
And the acronyms are so close together. And I've also seen other people confused about like what is the difference? What do these things mean? Why, if I run Nuxt generate, why is it doing this and not this other thing? And so, let's explain what that acronym is and what it means.
Yes, that's a great idea. Maybe let's turn it around this time. Maybe maybe you go for it, explain it, and if I have anything to add, then I'll come after you.
Sure. So SSG is static site generation. Is that what it stands for?
Absolutely.
Good. I was going to say server side generation, which wouldn't be completely wrong, but
well, it's close to that actually. Maybe that would confuse less people. But anyway.
And so there's a difference between a server side rendered application where it's still being rendered dynamically every time you hit that page, whereas a static site is exactly that. It's static, it's not dynamic. This is for things like blogs or other, documentation sites, things like that, where the content doesn't change or need to be dynamically generated based on different requests. And so we can actually generate this ahead of time. Another word that's often used is pre-rendered. Maybe that's why it adds to the confusion because there's so many different terms that describe these very similar concepts. And so, there's this distinction between, do you need to generate it dynamically? If yes, you have, are you generating it on the server or on the client? If it's not dynamic, you can do it statically. And then you're going to do it on the server in some way. And there's, again, many ways of doing this. You can do it at build time. You can build all your pages or render all the pages ahead of time, which is what I do for my blog, because
Same.
that it's straightforward and it works. But you can also do different kinds of building where you incrementally build it over time, and it gets complex.
Oh, exactly. But yeah, I think that's a very good summary of static site generation, also known as pre-rendering, because these two things are exactly the same. What I like to say about it is always think of, as you said, server-side rendering, but not on the fly, not dynamically, because it's a static side. So server-side rendering at build time, like as you said, ahead of time before it goes to the server. The good part is you get out static assets so you can host them everywhere. Very lovely. You don't need any kind of API connection unless you call APIs on the client side, like, oh yeah, you can submit a comment and that should go into the database. You need that. But if it's just about content that you, for example, grab from a CMS, then you don't need an API connection, because what Nuxt will do in this case, it will take all the requests and it will create the payload and save that as well. So some kind of JSON that's a bit compressed, and we'll put in all the data there. So you don't need to do the API call again somewhere, because that will also be weird. Like, okay, you have the data. Actually, it was like that in Nuxt 2, like years ago for a while. Like it was like, okay, you got the data. And then when you do a client-side request to another page, it will fetch the API again. And if you refresh the page, the content might be different. But yeah, luckily we got over that. And there was like a full static mode back then. And this is also the default now when you use Nuxt 3 with npx Nuxt generate.
Right.
And it's super useful for applications. And even if you say, I want to statically generate a site, but turn off server-side rendering, and you just generate one route, then you have your single page application again, because that's just an empty HTML file, maybe with a loading spinner, adding your JavaScript and your CSS in there, and you're back to the plain old SPA, which is why you can use a framework like Nuxt to build all kinds of applications, and you can switch that by just a few things in the config.
Yeah, and so you have a lot of flexibility with exactly how things get rendered and run and all of that. How would you define like the benefits of static versus server side rendering?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, that you can host it everywhere is a big plus. You don't need the server running all the time. And it's the faster it gets, because there's no API call. There's nothing. Nothing is faster than just plain HTML. So
just sending
that's
the files.
Yes, exactly. That's a big pro. Just putting in a CDN, cache it, and you're good. It's of course tricky if you need new data, because then you have to rebuild the whole site usually. So if you have to change things every couple minutes, then static site generation might not be for you. Unless also there are options to say, hey, please pre-render only these pages, and then it's fine. So if you have landing pages and they won't necessarily change, you can pre-render them, but still have a server running for the rest.
For my own website, I have the blog side of things all pre-rendered in that way, because they don't really change. I occasionally update them, but then I push those changes and then the build happens again and then the whole site's rebuilt. But that doesn't happen that frequently. But then I have the other part, my course platform side, which is interesting because it's technically just static content. It's like a blog, but it has authentication around it. So it's harder to do statically and have that authentication. And so then the way that I've set it up is the blog side is pre-rendered for speed and all of that. And then the other side, the course platform side, is just SSR, just the default.
Oh, so you use server-side rendering with something behind authentication there.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think you could even say for that part to turn off SSR
Yeah.
then you might lose a tiny bit of perceived performance, but then people will just be faster to login form, I suppose, or a bit slower to login form. And then you can even use that, because there's also one important thing to mention. Even if you do authentication on the server side, everything that's in the front end, like every component, every view page you write, is technically visible and human readable. You
Yeah.
just go through the JavaScript files. So if your content, I mean, I assume it does, but for all the listeners as well, if your content doesn't come from an API, people can just read it. And it's most important that it comes from an API and is secured if you don't want certain users to see it, because then people really need to be logged in, authenticated to get actually access to that.
Yeah. I have considered, well, yeah, to your point about the single page app thing, I want to do some testing with that to see if that's better or worse or what. There's also a way that you could have it pre-rendered, but then if you built a custom server to serve those pre-rendered files, and then that server has the authentication built in, then instead of just like giving it free access, then you sort of get like the best of both worlds. But I think that's a little more complex, and I'm not really interested in going down that route at this point.
Yeah, I also think you don't gain that much from that,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that setup would be a bit more complex for sure. But usually when it comes to authentication, then you have to use cookies then, right? Because if you need authentication during server-side rendering on the server side, no local storage, so there's that only way going for cookies, which is reasonable. But of course, it like you could reduce the complexity by just saying, hey, okay, it's an SPA, it's fine. And if people, let's say, bought access anyway, they probably don't bother with, I don't know, half a second more perceived loading time. Just like fictional number, right? I don't know the numbers for that, depending on the site.
That's the way that I've thought about it too. Obviously, I don't want it to be slow or terrible performance and UX like that. Like it matters, but at the same time, it's different than a blog post where someone is coming in from Google and they like, if it doesn't load fast, you're just like, all right, back. Let's check out the next one. Like if you're going through a course, you're spending hours on this thing anyway, and so it's loaded up and you're going through it.
I mean, ideally you bought it
thoroughly.
already, so that's the best part.
Yeah.
Like you're not losing customers or potential customers.
Right. Yeah.
People are more like, okay, nice, I'll get in there, and it will already feel fast and snappy, so that's good.
Mm-hmm.
Let's pick up one more thing which you already mentioned. You already said the word incremental.
Mm-hmm.
So of course that's not the end of the server-side rendering, like sub modes or patterns or however you want to call it. Yeah, there's of course more. Like I think especially with Next, the whole like incremental static generation or incremental static regeneration, ISG and ISR, or incremental static revalidation, I also heard. Anyway, we go all down the same road.
A lot of different terms.
Yeah, it's naming things is hard, but then just stick to one, please. It never works though. They all are ways to say, okay, I have dynamic server-side rendering, but in a way I don't want to like hit the server all the time. I have some cache in between. And depending on how that cache looks like, it's the one or the other. So let's go back for a second to static site generation. And the problem is, of course, if we need recent data or like very up-to-date things, then it's tricky. The other issue is, yeah, if you have like 100 blog pages, it's fine. But if you have, let's say, 100,000 articles or 100,000 items in an e-commerce store, it's tricky, right? Because the builds would take ages, and then you'd have to rebuild and so on and so on. So even if it's like not super real-time data, but more like I have a news website and I have 100,000 articles, which is for a bigger news website not that uncommon. You can't statically generate all of them ahead of time because that will take ages, hours, maybe even days. So that was one of the big problems also by the whole Jamstack movement, was a bit like, yeah, it's tricky. And then someone came up with ISG and ISR saying, okay, you know what, if we do the same thing as with dynamic server-side rendering, so we have a server there and it's rendering stuff, but why don't we cache the whole response? So why don't we just say like, okay, we take it, stick it in the cache, and when someone hits the page again, we'll just get that cache response. And that's more or less incremental static generation to say the sites won't be generated initially. The first user who hit the site, yeah, they have to wait a little bit because that's the initial server-side rendering, which might take longer because, API calls on the server and so on and so on. But after that, we just get the cached version.
So we're taking this binary choice between static or server-side rendered, and we're turning it into more of a spectrum where you can like, you could be fully static, you could be fully dynamic server-side rendered, or you could be somewhere in the middle and sort of kind of figure out what balance works for your application and your site, your needs in that way.
Exactly. And then you can even say, these are like more important. Let's cache them not that long, or these sites can be cached for a day. It's fine. And you can even go one step further and use SWR, which is another acronym for stale while revalidate, basically saying, okay, for my pages, I just set up, let's give them the cached version. So let's say you hit /about, and /about was never generated. Then you as the first user, you get the generated version. So it will take a little bit. It's fine. Now, if I hit the page, I get the cached version. But if you enable stale while validate, it will check, okay, is that cached version too old? Too old meaning it should be revalidated. But if we say yes, for example, it is too old, it should be revalidated, I still get the stale content, while the server in the background will revalidate the page, meaning it will update the cache with the newest entry, and then the user after me hitting the page will get the new website. And the same starts again. And that's a wonderful pattern if you say, I want to reduce the load on my server, because if I set it to 1 second, for example, I have 100 users going on the same page. I don't have 100 requests to the server, but one going to the server, the rest may be also waiting for the cache to populate or just get the things out of the cache. And then the server will like repopulate the whole thing once and you're good.
It's an interesting way of balancing performance for the end user and like serving them the content as fast as possible while still updating the content and regenerating it as needed. It is kind of like tricky to think about because it's like, wait, as a user, if you hit the endpoint, unless you're the very first one, you're never getting like the most recently generated one. You're always getting the cached version, which might be, as you had pointed out, it might be still valid, but it might also be like the old one, and then the next person gets the updated version. But it's kind of interesting to think about, because then it sort of it means that the routes on your app that are the most popular get updated more frequently, and the ones that no one goes to don't really get updated at all. And so it
That's
makes
true.
sense from that sense.
That's good and bad as well, right? And like, somebody might go to a page and gets like super old content. Though you can even you can even fix that by saying, if the cache entry is older than an hour, a day, whatever, then just do whatever the first user did with like do a full server-side rendering request. Then the user might have to wait a bit, but gets the most recent thing.
Right. So there's ways to catch that so you don't get like really old content. Yeah.
Yeah, you can basically say, okay, when should it be revalidated in background? When should the cache entry be thrown away? Like these are the two like maximum ages you can define.
So there's a lot of stuff with server-side rendering. It's a very complex, in-depth topic. And I think we've covered quite a bit of stuff here. There's certainly a lot of ways to optimize and to configure for your specific needs and for whatever, like literally whatever kind of app you are running, whether it's like a basic marketing page or a giant news site or a SaaS app or whatever else you're building.
Yeah, as long as it's public facing, you might need SSR at least for a tiny part of your application. That's true.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess there are a few more things that we could cover, but might be good for another episode. Like Nuxt server components could be very interesting to go into that a bit more in depth. Also, Islands architecture in Astro, something that's really interesting and getting a lot of traction. It's loved throughout the whole like ecosystem. But yeah, I also think now everybody should have a little bit of a better understanding with regards to server-side rendering. And if there are any questions left, then as usual, shoot us a message on some kind of social media, wherever you can find us. Leave a comment or tweet at DejaVue FM.
We'll see you next time.
Exactly. Stay tuned, and next episode, next week as usual. Goodbye.